attendance and for the public that is tuning in, and also deep appreciation for the journalists who are helping to spread the word of this very consequential process that's going on. Before we dive into the agenda, I'd like to ask everybody to please stand up and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag. Okay, thank you. We will move to agenda item 1, call to order and roll call. 1A, call for quorum. It is 12:32 p.m. on Monday, October 4th, 2021. I call this meeting of the Independent Redistricting Commission to order. For the record, the Executive Assistant, Valerie Newman, will be taking roll. When your name is called, please indicate you are present. If you're unable to respond verbally, we ask that you please type your name. Val.
That's the only reason.
Oh. We'll start over. Vice Chair Watchman.
Present.
Commissioner Lerner. Commissioner Meal.
Present.
Commissioner York.
Present.
Chairperson Newberg.
Present.
And for the record, we also have in attendance Executive Director Brian Schmidt, Deputy Director Lori Van Haren, Public Information Officer Michelle Crank, Community Outreach Coordinator Marie Chappell, Community Outreach Coordinator Alex Pena. From our legal team, we have Brett Johnson and Eric Spencer from Snell and Wilmer, Roy Herrera and Daniel Ariano from Ballard Spar, our mapping consultants, Mark Flahan from Timmins, Doug Johnson from NDC Research, and Angela Miller, our transcriptionist. Thank you. Back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Please note for the minutes that a quorum is present. Agenda item 1B, call for notice. Val, was the notice and agenda for the commission meeting properly posted 48 hours in advance of today's meeting?
Yes, it was, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Agenda item 2, approval of minutes from September 28th, 2021. We have 2A, the general session. We also have 2B, which was reflective agenda item 7A, which was discussion of the competitiveness factor under the constitutional guidelines. I'll open it up for discussion on the minutes if there is any. If there is no discussion, I'll entertain a motion to approve the general session and executive session minutes from September 28th.
Try that again. This is Commissioner Lerner. I move to accept the minutes for both the executive and general session.
Thank you, and make sure to speak into the mic. Do I have a second?
Vice Chair Watchman seconds, Madam Chair.
If there's no further discussion, I will take a vote on the minutes, general session and executive session from September 28th. Vice Chair Watchman.
Aye.
Commissioner Meal.
Aye.
Commissioner Lerner.
Aye.
Commissioner York.
Aye.
Commissioner Newberg is an aye, and with that, the minutes are approved from September 28th. We'll move to agenda item number 3, opportunity for public comments. Public comment will now open for a minimum of 30 minutes and remain open until the adjournment of the meeting. Comments will only be accepted electronically in writing on the link provided in the notice and agenda for this public meeting and will be limited to 3,000 characters. Please note, members of the Commission may not discuss items that are not specifically identified on the agenda. Therefore, pursuant to ARS 38-431.01H, action taken as a result of public comment will be limited to directing staff to study the matter, responding to any criticism, or scheduling the matter for further consideration and decision at a later date. With that, we'll move to agenda item number 4, discussion on public comments received prior to today's meeting. I will open it up to my fellow commissioners. I have a few comments that I'd just like to highlight. There was, I think, a fair number of people that have commented on the size of our mapping team screen. I'd say it's not just the visual, it's not just the size, I think it's the boldness of it. The lines can be quite faint, particularly when you're looking at a screen. So we'll be cognizant of that. There was some commentary on commissioners attending all of the public hearings and how we'll have access to that data if we're not there. All of the data will come to us, whether it's in written form or some of the technological overlay maps that our mapping consultants provide. We have transcripts, and it's not unprecedented, I'd like to say, in the previous commissions. In order to extend our bandwidth throughout the state, it's not possible for all commissioners to attend each and every meeting. I'd like to remind you we're volunteers, and we actually, most of us are still engaging in professional pursuits, but we're doing our due diligence to learn as much of the data as possible. Quite a few submitted specific comments related to boundary lines. I'd like to also, again, just reassure the public that that method of feedback is getting to us. It's not the mapping software, but we understand narratives, and that feedback is actually quite helpful, and I encourage it to keep coming. And then finally, yes, Prescott is on our radar for round 3. And everybody else who has opinions about where we ought to be after the draft maps are released and we engage in a third round of tour, we're very excited to cover as much of the state as possible. Okay, with that, any other discussion from my colleagues? We will move to agenda item number 5, update, discussion, and potential action concerning polarization data and report presentation from mapping consultants. If necessary for legal advice, we retain the ability to go into executive session, which we will outline if necessary. With that, I will turn it over to our mapping team.
Madam Chair, thank you. Doug Johnson from National Demographics. And I believe we're joined by Dr. Hanley on the WebEx. So I will let her give her initial presentation. Just to set the context, we are reporting today on the results of our analysis of the Native American voting patterns and of polarized voting in Maricopa County. The Pima and Pinal and Yuma analysis is still underway and will come in later on. But this should give us a very solid beginning to start talking about drawing maps. So I'll let her present, and then we'll work together to answer any questions you might have.
Hi, this is Lisa Handley. I am hoping you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, all right, good. I have reviewed the analysis that we did for Maricopa County and Apache and Navajo County, and that's what I'm going to discuss today. Let's start with the first slide. I am sure that you've heard about the Jingles prongs. This is from Thornburg v. Jingles, and the fact that to bring a successful two-suit, you have to meet 3 preconditions. First, you have to be able to show that you can draw a majority-minority district. Second, you have to show that minorities are politically cohesive. And third, you have to show that whites block vote to usually defeat minority-preferred candidates. And this, and if you are able to demonstrate these 3 preconditions, chances are you are going to have to draw districts that provide minority voters with an opportunity to elect their candidates of choice. And if you already have such districts, You will need to maintain those districts. Next slide. Now, we don't know the race or ethnicity of people who submit ballots. It's not on the ballot, so we have to use an estimation procedure to determine how voters are casting their votes. And there are two standard techniques, and one is ecological regression and the other is ecological inference. Now, I have used both of those to derive estimates of how Hispanics and non-Hispanics and how natives and non-native Americans have voted in recent elections. Next slide. So here is an example of an election in Maricopa County. In fact, this is a statewide election for governor in 2018, but the results are just for Maricopa County. And you can see in this chart, the first column identifies the contest and the candidates who ran. The second column, their political party. The third column, the race or ethnicity of the candidates. The vote percentage is the percentage that got in Maricopa County. And then the next three columns provide the estimates of Hispanic voters voting for these candidates. So ER would be ecological regression, EI is ecological inference, and HP is another method called homogeneous precinct analysis. This is actual real percentages. You can see that there aren't any homogeneous Hispanic precincts, but there are homogeneous non-Hispanic precincts. This is just reporting the election results of precincts that are overwhelmingly one race, in this case, either Hispanic or non-Hispanic, and it provides a good check on our ER and EI estimates. We expect them to be a little bit different because it's quite likely that voting in homogeneous precincts is not reflective of what voting might be in the jurisdiction as a whole and in more integrated areas. The bottom two rows provide estimates of Hispanic and non-Hispanic turnout. And I was hoping that Doug would explain the database to you. The database differed depending on whether we were looking at trying to estimate Hispanic voting behavior or Native American voting behavior. With Hispanic voting behavior, we actually use the voters list and use the census surname identifier to determine the number of Hispanic voters of total voters that turned out. So these are real numbers here. This is, for example, Hispanic turnout would be the number of voters with Hispanic surnames of Hispanic citizen voting age population, and the same would be true of non-Hispanic turnout. That is everybody who wasn't Hispanic, according to the surname list, divided by the number of citizen voting age population who were not Hispanic. So our ER estimates indicate that 100% of Hispanic voters supported Garcia. This is somewhat typical of ecological regression. It produces estimates that are near or even over the bounds of possibility, especially when voting is polarized. And this is one of the reasons that EI was developed. It does not produce estimates that are outside the range of the possible. The downside is it produces estimates separately for, say, the three candidates running here, so they won't necessarily equal 100. None will exceed 100, but when you add up the column, it won't equal 100. But the EI estimate indicates the same thing. An overwhelming percentage of Hispanics supported Garcia. And then you look at the non-Hispanic voters, and you can see that this was not the candidate that they supported, that at least 60% of non-Hispanic voters supported the Republican in that contest. This is an example of a polarized contest where Hispanics alone would have elected one candidate and non-Hispanics would have elected another candidate. Now, I looked at all elections in Maricopa County and two statewide elections. The two statewide elections were the two statewide elections in 2018 that included Hispanic candidates. In terms of the other elections I looked at state legislative and congressional elections, with the caveat that there had to be enough Hispanic voters to produce reliable estimates. Now, you will be supplied with the summary sheets that show the voting patterns for each election. I will tell you that in most cases, voting was polarized in Maricopa County, and that does mean that you will be drawing districts that provide minority voters with an opportunity to elect. Okay, the next slide, please. The analysis that I did, that was done in Apache and Navajo counties, was slightly different because we couldn't use the voter list and a census surname list to do this. Instead, we used citizen voting age population by race. And that means that we don't have turnout figures like we do for Hispanics. Now we're going to be estimating turnout figures. But other than that, you can see that the table looks pretty much the same. Now, this is a contest, 2018 general election for State Senate District 7. The split simply means that it's split across more than one county. And you can see here that, again, the ER, EI, and this time we do have homogeneous precincts that are heavily Native American, all point to very strong support for the Native American candidate. And when you look at the non-Native American voters, you can see that there is strong support for the opponent of the Native American candidate. So this contest is also polarized. So the difference between the two sets of analyses is the data that I use to estimate the behavior. So in the case of Hispanic and non-Hispanic, we had voters lists with a Spanish surname identified, and we were closer to the actual electorate because we were looking at voters lists. And here we're looking at citizen voting age population to produce this. But once again, voting was polarized in the contests that I examined, and every contest that I examined in Apache and Navajo counties. In Maricopa County, it wasn't every contest, but it was certainly the majority, if not the vast majority of them. Okay, next slide. What this means is that you have to, when you sit down, to draw districts that provide minority voters with an opportunity to elect their candidates of choice. What you cannot do is pick an arbitrary target, like, for example, 50% Black voting age population or 55% Hispanic citizen voting age population, and simply apply it as a target to all districts. You have to do what's called a district-specific functional analysis to determine if a proposed district that you're drawing will provide minority voters with the ability to elect minority preferred candidates. And I will leave it up to the lawyers to explain what all of this means in terms of the law, but in terms of what we're going to be doing, it simply means that you have to do an analysis individually for each district that you draw to make sure that it is in fact narrowly tailored to elect a minority preferred candidate without unnecessarily packing minorities or drawing the lines too thin so that minority voters will not have an opportunity to elect their candidates of choice. Next slide. There are two methods that I know of to do two statistical or sort of analytic methods that I know of to carry out a district-specific functional analysis. By functional, we mean we want to actually rely on the voting patterns of minority and white voters. So the first method, and the only method that you can use prior to drawing districts, is to take the estimates that we've produced through the racial block voting analysis. Remember, we have estimates now of participation rates, the degree of minority cohesion, that is the percentage of minorities voting for minority preferred candidates, and the amount of white crossover voting. And by white crossover voting, I'm talking about voting for the minority preferred candidate. So if voting is polarized, that means the majority of whites are supporting a different candidate, the opponent of the minority preferred candidate. But chances are there'll be at least some white crossover vote for the minority preferred candidate. And we can take these three things into account: participation rates, cohesion rates, and white crossover voting, and derive estimates of the minority population needed in specific areas to elect minority preferred candidates. The second method it can only occur once you have proposed districts. And using this approach, we'll identify some what I would call bellwether elections, elections that are racially polarized, in which there's a clear minority preferred candidate, a minority preferred candidate. And we are going to recompile those election results up to the proposed district. So we'll take them down from the precinct level to the block level, and then be able to re-aggregate them up to the district level to determine, to the proposed district, to determine if the minority preferred candidate would win. So that's called the disaggregated election results, or the recompiled election results method. Again, you would have to have already drawn some proposed districts to put that into place. So what I'm going to talk about today is the first approach. Next slide. I'm going to start by giving you an example. So let's say a district has 1,000 people of voting age, 50% of whom are Black and 50% of whom are white. Now, typically, this example is taken from the South. Typically, in the South, Black turnout rates are lower than white turnout rates. So we're going to, in our hypothetical election, 50% of the Blacks of voting age turn out to vote, and 60% of the white. This means, in our example, we have 250 Black voters and 300 white voters. Black voters strongly support their candidate of choice at a rate of 96%, but only 30% of white voters cast their votes for these candidates, with the other 70% supporting her opponent in the election contest. Next slide. So this is what happens. Here I've worked out the math for you. So we can see we've got the 500 voting age population, 50% of which turn out, the 250 voters. And then we have the votes for the Black candidate. So that's 250 times 96%, so 240 voters, 240 votes from Black voters for the Black preferred candidate, and 10 votes from Black voters for the white preferred candidate. And the same math for the white voters. We've got, of the 500, 60% turnout, so we've got 300 voters. 90 of those voters are casting their vote for the Black preferred candidate, and 210 for the white preferred candidate. So the Black preferred candidate actually wins this election with 60% of the vote. And this is because minority voters are very cohesive in this example, and they get some white crossover. So this is the math. In this instance, what we're doing is we know the voting age population, and we know the voting patterns. And what we're trying to do is estimate the votes that each candidate will receive. In what we're going to do is our unknown is actually going to be the voting age population. We are going to know the degree of minority cohesion. We're going to know the white crossover vote because we've estimated those. You saw those in an earlier table. And we're going to set the votes at 50%. We want our Black preferred candidate to receive at least 50% of the votes, and we're going to solve for the voting age population needed to produce that. Next slide. So in the bottom right-hand corner, you can barely see the example that I gave you from Apache and Navajo counties. And that shows up in the fourth line, the highlighted line here. So you can see that we have a turnout rate of 46.4%. We have Native American cohesion at 92.3%, with only 7.7% voting for the other candidate. We have non-Hispanic turnout at 50.9%. We have, that means, and 19.5% of the voters who are non-Native voted for the Native preferred, which means that 80.5% of the non-Native votes went to the opponents of the Native preferred candidate. And this is simple algebra here. What we're doing is an algebraic equation to determine what percentage of the citizen voting age population would be needed for the Native preferred candidate to win that contest. And it's 44.2%. This is not the only contest I looked at. In fact, this was the contest in which you had the highest degree of Native American cohesion and one of the lowest degrees of white crossover vote. But I did this for all of the elections that I examined. There are 5 in total, and you can see that the percent needed to win varies from the low of 44.2% that we just looked at to as high as 61.8%. And if you look at the columns to the left of this, you can see what the minority preferred candidate would have gotten in a 40% Native American district, a 45, a 50, a 55, and a 60. And you will see that in a 40% district, the Native American preferred candidate would have won none of the contests. In a 45%, won. And 50% we're up to 3. By the time we get to 55%, we're up to 4. But at 60%, we still haven't captured that 5th election. We need 61.8% to capture that election, the last election. This essentially summarizes the results of the analysis. All of the contests that I looked at, and this is 2018, 2020, were polarized. And while the State Senate District 7 needed only 44.2%, you would need as much as 61.8% for a Native American preferred candidate to win all of the elections that I've analyzed. Okay, next slide. So the next slide is, I examined a lot more contests than this for Maricopa County. What I did in order to fit this on a slide was look at those elections which had a minority competing in the election and in which the minority candidate was the minority preferred candidate. So again, the list of contests that I looked at was longer than this. So there were many more polarized contests than just these, but these are the contests that included minority preferred minority candidates. And you can see that some of these contests are not polarized. When a contest is not polarized, you in fact don't need any Hispanic voters to elect the Hispanic preferred candidate, because of course, non-Hispanics would have elected that candidate without any Hispanic votes. So you don't see any calculations in the second to last column when the voting is not polarized. And then looking down the column, you can see that it varies from as low as 19.4% in a contest where the minority preferred candidate gets over 40% crossover vote to as high as 60%. So it varies pretty dramatically in terms of the percent Hispanic citizen voting age population. And because of that, I would suggest that the second method that I discussed, looking at disaggregated election results, recompiled up or reconfigured up to the proposed district lines, will be a very important tool, because in some instances, it looks like you're not going to even need a majority Hispanic citizen voting age population, but in other areas, you might in fact need more than 50%. So again, my analysis indicates you're going to have to look at recompiled election results for every Hispanic opportunity district you draw to determine if the Hispanic preferred candidate will win. Last slide. So you need a racial bloc voting analysis to determine if voting is polarized. We have done a fair amount of that so far, and in the counties that I've just presented, there's no question that voting is polarized. And we have carried out the beginnings of a district-specific functional analysis, indicating that you are going to need certainly majority, minority, Native American districts. And in many instances, you'll need the same for Hispanic districts, but not all instances. And what you're going to have to do is turn to disaggregated election results that will be even more area specific to look at your proposed districts. Now, nothing that I've said thus far means that you cannot draw substantial minority population districts under different conditions, such as communities of interest, if race isn't the predominant factor. But what I'm talking about here very specifically is drawing districts that satisfy the Voting Rights Act, given that you have racially polarized voting. And that completes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
If I could?
Yes, and I have a question though also, so please.
Yes, I just wanted to ask Dr. Hanley to clarify one
Doug,
thing.
is your mic on?
Oh, yes, there we go. So I just wanted to ask Dr. Hanley to clarify one point. When she was talking about the math on the slide about Maricopa County and talked about how Congressional District 7 did not come up as, it came up as not polarized mathematically. I just wanted to clarify if she talked about that versus at the conclusion, where I think is the main point, which is that she found all of these areas are polarized. So Dr. Hanley, if you could address that, if just making sure that the mathematical finding on the Maricopa slide doesn't mean you thought CD7 is not polarized.
So the conclusion that voting is polarized doesn't rest on one election alone. Although you could say, you know, in any given instance, you could say this election was polarized or not. But you have to look for a pattern, a voting pattern across time. And so we have a lot of contests that we can look at in Maricopa County. And it turns out that, as I said, a strong majority of them are polarized. And the third prong of jingle says minority voters, preferred candidates are usually defeated by whites block voting against that candidate. So here, that particular contest was not polarized. However, most of the contests I looked at were polarized. Hence, you do need to draw minority opportunity districts in Maricopa County.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
My question is just a very small point. I want to make sure I understand the data. Was I understanding it correctly that in terms of calculating the percentage needed to elect candidates of your choice that look like you're statistically adjusting for voter turnout per that specific minority group? So it's not based on equal turnout, you're adjusting it for what that specific group traditionally looks like in terms of voter turnout. Am I
That's
understanding that
correct.
correctly?
Yes,
Okay, thank you.
you are correct. The estimates are included in the calculations.
Thank you. Other questions? If not, Doug?
I've got a quick question.
Please.
I appreciate your presentation, Doctor. You went through some math on Maricopa County and then on polarization. Review with us real quick why the 60% number was so important.
I'm sorry, why the 60% rule is so important? Is that
Yes.
what you said?
Yes.
Well, the 60% rule went by the wayside quite a while ago. Originally, this applied to the South, and these were lawyers sitting around saying, well, let's see, if we draw a 50% district, we're not accounting for the fact that we're talking about population. It turns out that minorities tend to have a higher percentage of children, so they're not of voting age. So we're going to correct that by 5%. Now we're up to 55%, I think. And then we're going to correct for the fact that minorities turn out at a lower rate than whites do in the South. So we're going to bring it up to 60%. And that's how we got the 60%. And that's how we were operating in the 80s and possibly the early 90s. So it was a rule of thumb devised by lawyers, broadly speaking, and it was not a district-specific analysis. And it was quite clearly wrong, at least it is now, because if you look at the South, if you look across the country, in fact, you'll see that the majority of congressional districts that elect minorities to office are not majority minority. They are less than majority minority. So it's important to look very specifically at the area that you're in. There are still places that you would need as much as 60%, but there are other places, like many congressional districts in the South, that you don't even need 50%.
Commissioner York, if I can just add to that, I think the 60% rule was a rule of thumb before we had all these sophisticated mathematical models. And now that these models are available, the courts expect us to use these rather than just a rough rule of thumb.
Sorry. Learning this system. So in this case, so thank you again for the presentation. So in this case, as we move the lines each time, we're going to be running this data, take a closer look as we create some districts. We'll run the data, we'll kind of look at those numbers for the polarization. Is that correct?
So
Yes, I would just rephrase it. Rather than for the polarization, we'd look to see if we're hitting those target numbers to achieve our goals.
Correct, yeah. Better explanation. All right, as a follow-up though, just as a continuing on that idea that the numbers are going to be different per district. So we'll look at those numbers, but they're, as you said, not the 60 rule. They'll vary by district depending on the population and voting patterns and all.
Dr. Hanley, do you want to address that, or do you want me to?
That's correct. You are at this point obliged by the court to do a district-specific functional analysis and not just look at the demographics, but look at the voting patterns as well. You'll have the results of the voting patterns analysis that I will have done. But you will be looking at the demographics and the percent needed to win and the recompiled election results in conjunction with one another as you're drawing the district.
Other questions or Doug, Mark, additional color context?
That's all I have.
Okay. If there are no other further questions, thank you so much, Dr. Hanley. We appreciate the thoughtful analysis. And we will move on to agenda item number 6, draft map decision discussion and possible action concerning revisions to the grid map. We're here at the main event. We will be addressing both legislative map drawing, congressional map drawing. I do want to just make a note that we reserve the right to go into executive session in case there is a desire or need for obtaining legal advice. Before I turn it over to the mapping team, I'd like to actually offer some thank yous and provide a little context. You know, it's been a long time building to this moment, 8, 9 months. I don't remember the exact time frame. I want to thank our staff. I want to thank our consultants. This team, you know, you have embraced this in a very real, very deep, very personal level. And on behalf of the commission, I want to thank you for your dedication and the seriousness with which you're embracing this responsibility. To my commissioners, your collegiality, your commitment, your ethics, it's been not just an honor, but honestly, it's a pleasure, and I'm so excited to go into the trenches with you, the 4 of you. I mean that, you know, very sincerely. I'm going to lean on you. The pressure is all 5 of us. I expect you to come to the table with substantive information. We'll come and negotiate. We're going to debate, and we're going to have a very robust dialogue that, with a final product, embraces all 5 of our perspectives. To the public, thank you for your dedication, your participation. We're in need of your feedback. I ask all of you, and this is to the media as well, give us some space and some time. We have many days laid out for the draft map, and then on top of that, you know, an additional tour to revise maps. It's going to be a process where we're going to give and take, and each day, let's not make too much of what that specific one day does. Because, you know, to the extent that we have the time and the space to really embrace this, it's complicated, maximize all 6 constitutional criteria, I think that's going to serve our commission and state well. And with that, I'm super excited to turn it over to our mapping team to begin the conversation on adjusting these grid maps. Turn it over to Mark and Doug.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We do have a presentation for you before we begin the grid map session. And you can see I brought a bigger team with me today. So Brian Kingery over here is going to run the slideshow for us. And then we also have Parker Bradshaw in the audience, Colby Chafin, and Brody Helton. Sorry about that. So go ahead and hit the next slide, Brian. So the couple things that we have listed out for you guys, just so we have a quick review before we go into the grid map portion. First one is our social economic app. Brian, next slide. So this is all demographic data for the entire state of Arizona that allow you to go see that. We've talked about it before. It has multiple different demographic points for the entire state. The two different products that we have built for you, the story map and the web app, the URL is on the bottom of the slide. The next slide, Brian. We talked about community of interest. So we found that there's 182 different groups of community of interest, and we have shown all the different overlaps that have crossed each other for the entire state. So when you look at the community of interest map and you see the darker red, that means that there was more overlaps where people were describing their community of interest in that target. And then it sort of spirals out from there to a very light gray. Also on that map, there was another 200 plus paper written surveys that were turned in, and they are available in an Excel spreadsheet that is sitting on that community of interest. Brian, why don't you click the link for a second? Yes, no, maybe so. Okay, go ahead and scroll down a tiny bit. Scroll down on the screen. So you can see here, right here, this is what we started with, all of our input from the public. There was 910 different digital submissions, and this is what it looks like on a total statewide map. So we want to take that down and distill it to more usable data. And you can see, here's an example of that 182 different groups that, that we identified. And here in the Explore the Data, there's an interactive web map that you can start to look at what was the highest ranking to what was the lowest ranking, and to see the exact targets in that map as you guys are going about trying to move the lines. And you can see here, Brian's turned on the highest and the high, so you can start to see where the highest overlaps have occurred in that one area. Go ahead and scroll down. The next thing that we have for you is just a point map that shows you all the different locations that somebody submitted a community of interest for. And Brian, why don't you zoom into Phoenix? You can start to see, as Brian's going to zoom in, you can see how they start to change. So the bigger circles means that there's more community of interest there than just one. And as you zoom into the map more, you can start to see the names of the different community of interest that people submitted into the system. And what you can do is you can click on one and it will bring up a paper map that you can print off, and you can see exactly where they believe their community of interest is. Go ahead and scroll down now, Brian. And you can, go back up. So you can see here, there's the all community PDF. So if somebody is interested in downloading all 182 maps for all of the community of interest, they can click that button and they'll get a map book with 182 different maps depicting all of the community of interest that we have identified here. Go ahead and go down. Right here is the paper-based forms. So you can see that there was 234 paper-based surveys that were turned in. You can click on the results of the paper-based survey, and that's all the results in an Excel spreadsheet that you could download and read today, available to you. Go back to the PowerPoint now. Go to the next slide. So as of today, we have 37 different submitted maps into our redistricting system. We have 20 congressional full maps for the entire state, and we have one congressional focused map. And what the congressional focused map is, last week we allowed people to submit a single district for both the congressional and the legislative. So now when they log into the system, they can not only get an entire statewide map, but they can also submit us a single district. And we broke out the data to show the difference between both of them. On the legislative side, we got 14 statewide legislative maps, and we got 2 legislative focused maps. So for a grand total of 37. And that is all available on the IRC Mapping Hub. And you can get there from irc.az.gov and click on the Maps section, and it will take you there. So you can go explore the data in real time. You can see it on a map. You can see exactly what their descriptions are. So I urge you to check that out. Next slide. The other thing that we did late last week and over the weekend is we enabled the system for people to be able to view all of the different submitted plans in the redistricting system. So why is this important? And the functionality that you get is now you can open a submitted plan in the redistricting system and you can begin to look at the demographic points. You can turn on and turn off things. And as you can see, there's sort of just a quick wizard there is when you're in the redistricting system, you hit the open button, then you go to shared plans, and then you go to RXO_submitted plans, and those are all the submitted plans that have been turned into the system. So this will allow you to turn on competitive data and demographics for your own liking as you view and understand them. Go to the next slide. There's a couple things about themes. So we can turn on themes when you guys are looking at the grid maps or asking questions. It'll allow us to do multiple different things on the screen so you can get a real feel of demographics or the competitive data going forward. Next slide. The other thing in the redistricting system that will allow you to do is to compare any submitted plan versus the current grid map. So you can start to see the changes that have been made that public has submitted to you guys versus your current grid map or against the current map that you've had us draw. Next slide. The other thing is it allows us to bring up a lot of charts live in the system so you can start to see how the demographic points look like, how the population breakdown is, and how the district distribution lies. Next slide. And last, just to sort of put it out there, is that anytime somebody submits a map, we do have a bunch of different integrity checks. We have dual assignment, population summary, district count, the maximum deviation, null assignment to make sure that geographies are only in one district, and the connectivity check. And also we can export any reports into a plan that we are currently doing. Next slide. And that's what I have for you guys today. So good luck.
Quick question, Mark. Is 37 a lot, or is that a small number? Or?
I believe the last commission got a little over 20 submitted maps. Don't quote me on that. But I think we've already exceeded what the 2011 commission has received, at least that has been put on their website that I can find from 2011.
Right. Well, and to the public, I mean, you can still submit maps, correct?
Yes, still open. Feel free to submit.
I think that's actually a really important point. I had some people ask me today, is it too late? I mean, this process, our tentative goal date, December 22nd, of course, that's, you know, I don't want to, it's more than aspirational. We're very much wanting to meet that deadline. But we're going to be moving these lines for weeks. And so please keep the data coming. There's no deadline.
And just as a follow-up as well, they can still now start to submit paper, right? And that's not included in this number. Do you know if we've received many?
In that number, no, that does not include paper. To date, we have received no paper.
No paper's been submitted for people, because we were doing that where.
Forgive me. Yes, we have received public or paper maps, but we do not have a total off the top of our head.
Right, and at some point, then those will be placed in a file where we can access those, hopefully in the next.
Yes.
Thank you.
And Madam Chair, I would add to that too, just that we're seeing what we hope, which is this is picking up steam. You know, of course, the first day the tool launches, we didn't get much, but I believe we got 8 maps in the last 18 to 24 hours of those 37. So it is picking up steam, and I would expect that to continue as people continue to work on their maps. And it's worth noting, as you mentioned at the beginning, Chair, that there's still one more hearing as well this week. So we're definitely still open to hearing from people in person and through submitting their maps.
And we're continuing to hear feedback and data through a narrative version, through public comments, through meetings, et cetera. So, you know, the maps that we have received are but one form of information and data that the commission is considering. Doug, if you'd like to maybe lead us in the next portion.
So with the report concluded, now the step moves more to your 5 chairs, and you've received a lot of input, a lot of comments from the public, and 37 maps, plus don't forget the 900 plus community of interest maps that were received in the first round. So the thought is at this point for the commission to focus on the high level. You know, at this point, the maps are still just the grid. And we've got a long ways to go, as you said, before we get to the final map. So we're not really worried about is the map going through First Street or Second Street. What we're looking for at this point is the big picture issues that the commission has heard about and wants to address now. You know, perhaps tribal reservations should not be divided among multiple districts within one reservation. Medium-sized cities, whatever issues you've heard and that have resonated with you and in your judgment are worthy of at least being drawn into the map to see what happens when we do that. We would welcome your input now. You can proceed however you wish. I would suggest, one thought is that each of you kind of walk through the 5 of you and give your high-level points and focus things that you've heard, and we can see where there's consensus and where there might be multiple maps that we would be coming back to. And to the degree that Brian and Mark can show you things live on screen as you have questions about what you've heard, we certainly have the system live. I suspect, especially since we're talking about big picture items, most of these requests are going to be things we'll have to take away, draw into the system, and then come back to you with. But we can certainly talk about how that might be done, in at least a theoretical level at this point. So that would be my suggestion, but we're happy to work with you however you want. But my suggestion would be to start out with kind of just going through what are the big picture issues you've heard and things you'd like to see incorporated into the map at this point.
Thank you. And as what I'm going to suggest is, we'll take turns amongst the commissioners. Maybe we'll do our traditional voting order, if that's okay with you, Vice Chair Watchman, not to throw you on the spot. But I'd like to remind my commissioners that to the extent that we can incorporate as many of the 6 constitutional criteria in our analysis, I think that just makes it a little clearer, helps us with consensus, and helps us to have a more thorough conversation. Because everything that we do, I think, touches upon all of those principles. And with that, just again, no pressure, this high-level beginning dialogue about thoughts of initial priorities. Vice Chair Watchman, if I could turn the microphone to you, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, colleagues, members of the commission, and staff. And so it's been an honor, as you mentioned, Chairwoman Newberg, to be a part of this. And so I want to express my thanks to my colleagues and the staff and everybody associated with this process. And so certainly we're at a point where a lot of discussion needs to take place. But from my background and, several reasons why I was, believe appointed, the Native American community obviously is near and dear to me, being a member of the Navajo Nation. And so we have 22 Indian reservations in this state, and from a land-based standpoint, that's roughly 25 to 30% of the state is Indian lands. And so I think making sure that our districts don't split our reservation boundaries, then of course keeping tribes as close together as possible, so that there is a chance of the tribes in the state voting in a candidate of choice. And so I know that we have a concentration of tribes in the northeast part of the state, the south around Tucson, and then, of course, you have a couple tribes in the Yuma area, and then a couple up along the Colorado River, and then right in the center of the state. And so, the challenge, obviously, is to keep the tribes in one area. So, making sure that our tribes are addressed in the reservation boundaries, I think, is very, very important. Next to that is just, I think, the Latino, Hispanic voting interests, and so certainly you have big pockets of Hispanic voters in the Phoenix area, southern Phoenix of note, Tucson, and then, of course, in the, I guess I'll say the Yuma County area, and what they obviously contribute to the state. And so I think those are two focal points that I want to pay attention to. And then during our hearings, I heard, many comments about communities of interest. And so, like, for example, the Verde Valley and, where they would like to be considered, should it be included with Prescott or the Flagstaff area? I think I tend to see the Verde Valley, which includes some tribes, by the way, probably in the same community of interest of Flagstaff in northern Arizona. Likewise with Yuma, we heard from Yuma, should those districts be, and this is congressional, mind you, should it be a part of Maricopa County? I think that geographic area and as a community of interest certainly has this distinct elements of being maybe considered separately. And then, of course, we have our border, if you will, border areas. And so, the good question for me is, how many congressional districts, or how do we address our border issues? The Tohono Reservation actually has a significant boundary between the United States and Mexico. And so I've heard, the last couple of years of many challenges for the sovereign nation of the Tohono in working with the federal government, if you will, to try to exercise some control and dealing with the boundaries. And, it's interesting to note that there are many members of the Tohono Nation that are also citizens of Mexico. And so many challenges to try to exercise their control and their sovereignty. And while you have this borderline between them, but I guess where I'm going with that is that, if we could limit the number of congressional districts along the border, I think would be helpful, so that when we deal with border issues, immigration, drug trafficking, and those things, I think it's very, very important to consider. I think I have probably a whole slate of other issues, but I'll start with those as talking points. And I appreciate, again, the opportunity to be here. So I'll turn it back over to you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
If I may just ask a clarifying question for Commissioner Watchman. Could you repeat what you're saying about Yuma County? I wasn't sure. You talked about Yuma County with Maricopa.
Well, yes,
that was a good
thank
idea
you.
or not.
To clarify, Yuma County, the tribes and the city of Yuma, relative to Maricopa County, and I guess being in the same district on both fronts, congressionally and from a legislative standpoint, are those two communities of interest? I mean, Yuma and Maricopa, are they separate communities of interest? And I would tend to think that they're separate. And so I did hear that the issues that impact, I'll say west side of Phoenix, the valley, if you will, is more akin to being Maricopa. And then when you get south and start heading toward Yuma, so you're moving to more of a urban setting to a more farm, rural-based setting. And so certainly different thoughts and different needs from their congressperson or their state rep or senator, if you will. So be mindful of that. I guess that's my point. Thank you.
Doug, if I can just ask a clarifying question, this is a 30,000-foot, it sounds like, conversation. Are you wanting feedback as it relates to both legislative and congressional boundaries right now? Are we wanting to bifurcate this into one versus the other, or just first start broader issues?
Yeah, at this point, we're pretty broad, so
Okay.
covering both is fine. As you mentioned, later on, when we're talking more specific changes to maps,
Okay.
we'll definitely want to split it. And perhaps when we come back with the results of these maps, we'll probably come back separately, because obviously what a given change would do to the surrounding districts in one map will be very different from what that given same change would do to the surrounding districts.
Yeah, and thank you, Madam Chair. That was my perspective at a 35,000-foot level, kind of big picture items, and then we can start drill down into more detail. But just as we're talking here, get the conversation going. Thank you.
Yeah, I just, even at the 30,000-foot level or 35,000-foot level,
What are you-
sometimes there's still slight differences. And so let's just be cognizant, if there's anything unique about what you're sharing to one versus the other, let's make sure we articulate that to the mapping team. Otherwise, we'll just presume that it's broad-based feedback. Commissioner Meal.
Again, thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you for your leadership as we're finally here and the gun has gone off. So here we go. This will be interesting and exciting. And I'll try to answer the 35,000-foot questions only right now and then hold other things for later. And one of the things we've talked about, and it's one of the specifically addressing the 6 criteria, is equal population. And we haven't talked about it very much, but I would emphasize that in the Congressional, it's obviously extremely precise. But I think we shouldn't be cavalier on the legislative side about equal population. And I think that the wording in the Constitution is very clear that equal means equal. And that doesn't mean we need to have it as narrow as the Congressional of one person. But I would encourage us to stay very close to truly equal in the legislative races. And I think, again, at a big 35,000-foot level, let's not lose sight of that. Most of the rest of my comments will relate to things that we heard at the public hearings, which I appreciate all the people who've given us input. It's clear that the smaller cities sure don't want to be split up, and there's no reason to. And some of the counties can come in as whole counties, especially in the rural areas. We heard a lot of feedback that the rural communities want to try to get rural districts where they have a real commonality of interest. And you had people like Yavapai County not wanting to jump down into Maricopa. You had people in North Anthem who want to make sure they are part of Maricopa County and not viewed as rural. So I think we want to be really sensitive to the rural city distinctions where we can. I think we're going to need, practically speaking, to really concentrate on the majority-minority districts. Congressionally, there were 2, and on the legislative, 8 in the last set of maps. And I think that we really need to pay attention to make sure that we meet the federal requirements on those majority-minority districts. So when we really get into specifics, I think starting with some of those in the rural communities and working our way into the cities is actually going to be, practically speaking, a good way to go. But I think we heard a lot of testimony on communities of interest. And as we get into the more specific 2 different maps, I'll certainly have a lot more to say. But I think those are the big picture things to start with.
Commissioner Lerner.
Thank you. And again, thank you to staff for everything you're doing, and thank you to my fellow commissioners and our chair. I look forward to working with you in this collegial manner, as we've been doing. A lot of it, when we're talking about this 35,000 level, is very duplicative from my perspective of what's already been said. I think we're on the same page in some of the big picture items that we've been hearing. So I'm in agreement with everything that's been said without wanting to duplicate all of that. I think it's really just a couple of other points. We've heard really strongly from the Yuma area about how they like the current configuration. We did not hear that in many other areas. And so I want to acknowledge that because so often we heard we want to change. But Yuma really commented often about that, so I think we want to acknowledge that. In terms of one other piece, I know we've talked a lot about school districts and seeing if we can work with school districts in some way. So it's complicated, I think, but when we get to rural areas, I think that's one place we could probably take a closer look at those. It may not work effectively in an urban area. The school districts, we might have to split in some areas, even if we don't want to, just for population purposes. But in the rural areas, I would think that the school district boundaries might be something we could take a look at so that we're trying to keep them together as much as possible, since that's an important part of what goes on, especially in all parts of the state, of course. A couple of other points we heard is to try, that I want to acknowledge, is to try to acknowledge some of the economic drivers that are in some communities and see if we can keep those together in some ways. We heard a lot about the Copper Corridor, for example. We heard about the Colorado River and water as another area. So I'm looking in those, and from that perspective, the border, as was mentioned, important connector for people. So I look at those things that are big connectors as part of it. I also want to acknowledge the public that comes to the meetings. We have had, and also those that comment. We know that there's those that can't attend the meetings or have not been able to. So the comments that are submitted add into this. So it's not just those public comments from the hearings that we're, I think, reacting to. It's everything that we're getting. And the only other thing I'll mention with regard to our Native people is that we want to make sure that none of the tribal areas are split. From my perspective, legislative, right now on our grid map does that with the legislative area. I think pulling those together helps in all of the tribes. Everything else, I'll wait till the next round. So thank you. Yeah, Commissioner York.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon. Thank you for all you being here. I echo a lot of what my fellow commissioners said. I mean, my thoughts go to the Borders Rights Act and the majority districts, to tribal lands being not split up, and then to go and follow the input from the communities of interest along the Copper Corridor, northern Arizona, southern Arizona, the border. And so I'm kind of on the same page as everybody else. One of the things I did want to mention is that we'll continue to try to focus on minority communities in the Black communities and in the LGBT communities to make sure that we have those in our back of our minds as well, because they did come to our meetings and make presentations.
Okay, thank you. The things that are on my mind, in addition to what's been said, very focused on minority communities, where they are, how it fits in with broader communities of interest, because just, not all minority communities are monolithic. So I want to understand where they are. In particular, I think there's a burgeoning community of Asians in the Southeast Valley, Chandler, Mesa, Glendale. It may be rising to a level that warrants, on the legislative front, some attention. There are some financial corridors, historical corridors that seem to work together. The Copper Corridor works well. The Quad Cities seem to be pretty united and seem to be pretty attached to Prescott. The southeast part of our state seems to get along quite well. Cochise County, Santa Cruz. Sorry, if I'm not speaking into the microphone, I really apologize. Yuma is a very interesting area. They're working very well. I'm personally struggling because there's competing narratives about uniting singularly communities of interest, and yet there's also this narrative that sometimes split representation. can bring additional attention and resources, and that in particular with the border is on my mind. There isn't a monolithic view of what's in our collective best interests with, protecting our border interests. So I think that needs some exploration. Tucson, I'm learning a lot about the different communities. We're going to have to study that demographic makeup and how to see how to maximize, empower really competing communities of interest. And I'd like to tie in competitiveness here. I know, there's been a ton of conversation about competitiveness. It's one of 6 constitutional criteria. It is the last, and it's conditioned on not causing detriment. I'd like us to focus very seriously on when a lack of competitiveness causes detriment to the minorities' communities. In some areas, for example, or rural areas, maybe the minority communities, are a little more comfortable. Their competing interests, maybe they're not happy on the social front, but maybe, let's say, a farming or agriculture, maybe there's other interests that unite them. That's very different than an area that is non-competitive, where the minority group is deeply unhappy. And so I think we have to dive deep into non-competitive areas and understand who they are and what's not working or what is working, because it's, again, not monolithic. I'd like to look at the West Phoenix growth as it relates to both a burgeoning group. It's explosive. It also seems to be a strong Latino hub. And so when I think about, additional districts that are going to be necessary and where to tap into that growth, that's very much on my mind. As we dive into the minority districts, which I think may need to be focused on, I don't want to say first, but we have a responsibility to understand where our demographic groups are. I just want to remind my colleagues again, never are we drawing boundaries based on one singular issue. We're going to be balancing all of these needs together. So I know it's complicated, but as much as we can continue to incorporate all of these principles in our dialogue, I think it's going to serve us well. And so with that, I this may not have been very helpful to you, Doug, but I'm going to turn it over to you and ask you, now what? Now what information do you want? Because I think we could probably give you a ton more.
Sure, thank you. So this is all a very good start to the process. We'll note as we, especially as we get more into more specific changes, we'll be talking more and more about, let's make this change for Prop 106 Provision A. Let's make this change for Proposition C. Or the one you'll say the most, D, which is communities of interest. I think just about everything you were just describing was that, with a couple of exceptions. One thought for each of you to focus on, and for the public who's watching and sharing their thoughts as we go through this, is 100% agree. Prop 106 is clear. The Voting Rights Act is a federal requirement. It is a top priority of the state. We do run into an area that we've talked about in past meetings of when we comply with the Voting Rights Act, race cannot be the predominant factor. So when we are looking at those West Phoenix areas, as you're talking about the growth areas, when we are looking at areas in other parts of Phoenix or the greater Phoenix area or Tucson or even Yuma, we want to tie into other historical communities, the history of South Tucson and the neighborhoods around it, those kinds of community things that that would drive it on a community basis, as well as it being sensitive to the Voting Rights Act. So as you're thinking about additional directions to give us, those kinds of thoughts would be perfect. I have not looked at this, so I don't know if in the South Phoenix and Tucson area, the school districts, primarily in South Phoenix, because it's such a big single city area, if school districts would make sense as a way to look at dividing that up or not. That's one thing that hopefully the public will give input on, and all of you will give us direction on. So let me check. We have lots of people trying to take notes to make sure we catch all of this. So let me see if any of them have any questions or follow. Good. Checking my notes here for a couple of things. So yes, as we're drawing the seats that are voting rights sensitive, as we tend to refer to them, we do want to be sure that they are not just being drawn based on race, but they are also tied into community things like your South Phoenix, like school districts, whatever ties those neighborhoods together, so that we're meeting both those requirements. I will note as well, as you started to touch on, competitiveness obviously is a big factor in all this process. It is harder to describe, but and hard to nail down until people really get into the nitty-gritty of the numbers. So as we start doing this, people will see these impacts. As we come back and report to you on these changes, you'll see how the numbers of the districts that we're changing shift on a competitiveness factor, and be able to consider that as well at that point. But if residents are looking at the maps and playing with drawing maps and want to suggest competitive districts, certainly this is the time for them to start doing that. And there have been a couple of interesting maps. It's one thing too that would be useful to us on the mapping side is if you are, as you're going through the public submission maps, to react to any that you have a particularly positive reaction to. We're not looking to, if we end up with another 900 maps like a daily community of interest input, we're not looking to need to go through each one of the 900 and strike them out. But we are certainly looking for things that you see in those maps that are appealing to you. Just as a kind of a brainstorming thought, there is one very creative and very different map that's come in. So just as an example of how you can look at this and think about, does this make sense? Does this not make sense? Mark, if you can bring up CD0003. Again, this is something that I don't believe has ever come up in a past redistricting cycle. So I throw it out there just so people can react to it. Certainly not endorsing and not criticizing this, but it does give you a sense of how this public input can process it. This is a congressional map. Going to the points you raised earlier, mainly on the legislative side about making sure, number one, that we don't divide any tribes, but then we try to put tribes together. And someone got very creative. I didn't warn Mark that I was going to ask him for this, so give him a second to bring it up. CD0003. There you go. So this is, when all of our historic maps kind of tie, legislative, we usually think of this and we put the Havasupai and the Hualapai and the Navajo and the Apache together. Someone kind of went the other way around the state and actually got all the way around to the southern border with the district. So these are the kind of creative things that come in that we're looking for the public to react to and to offer you their thoughts. This is obviously one person's idea. But there's a lot of creativity out there, both at the dais here and out in the community. So I do encourage people to go through the site, go through the maps, especially now when it's 37 is very manageable size, and offer thoughts of this is crazy or this makes a lot of sense. And I expect there to be both reactions to all kinds of things. But I thought this was a creative thing. Obviously, to make a decision, you have to zoom in and see what it does internally as well. But there are lots of creative thoughts coming along. And this is a good highlighting for folks that followed the last hearing, and there was lots of talk about the I always mispronounce it, my apologies, but the Tohono O'odham tribe. Everyone is very familiar with the large part that is, Commissioner Watchman was talking about, goes across the border and all that. There's also the piece of it right next to the city of Tucson. And you can see that that's the red arm at the bottom of the map here is the district stretching out to grab that non-contiguous piece of the tribe to make sure that all those tribal areas are together. And then there's even a second tribe that has a reservation right next to it right there in the southern edge of Tucson. So interesting maps online. Certainly encourage people to take looks at them and use those to inspire ideas that appeal to you as you go through this process. But yes, I think we got putting the tribal reservations together is going to drive a lot of change in the rural seats particularly. So we'll have a very different grid coming out in the rural area just from that one change.
Can I ask a clarifying question. This is actually very important as it relates to the boundaries. When we talk about keeping tribal communities together, what are we talking about? We have 22 tribes. And when we look at a map like that, I saw these maps and they're creative and and I was thinking, okay, Tom O'Halloran is in the, he's going to go all the way around there. And those are the kinds of things that we have to think about. Is it possible for one single representative to actually cover that geographic area? We have a unique state with so much population in such a narrow group. Anyway, that was my thought as you were describing that.
Well, and you're starting to step into a discussion that every one of these commissions has had about, as many of you mentioned, the urban and rural, sense of different communities is very, very strong in Arizona. But at the same time, any rural district to get to 700,000 plus members of a congressional district is going to be huge to get that number of people. So it is yes, it's incredibly difficult to represent that seat. I think at one point, Arizona's district was described as I think that congressional district was the largest district in the country. Obviously, Alaska with just one seat is bigger. But I think in terms of districted states, it was one of the biggest, if not the biggest. So that is a clear trade-off. If you're going to be a rural district, even just a legislative district, it's going to be huge. And traditionally, we have seen the number one, each tribe kept intact and not divided. But then number two, as I believe Commissioner Watchman brought up in his first discussion, not just keep each tribe undivided, but try to keep the nearby tribes with each other in one seat. And then you reach a question of what counts as nearby. And when you're in a rural area, that can be fairly distant. This may take it too far, but this may also be a good idea. It's an interesting way of thinking about it. And definitely, this is the interesting thing when we're talking about the Voting Rights Act, that occurred to me as you were each commenting, is as I mentioned, for the Latinos, we have to be careful to tie it to communities and not just say, let's put race on the map and just draw lines around it. For the Native Americans, it's much easier because the population concentrations are so tied to reservation lands, which are governmental entities. They are sovereign nations. That community of interest is very clear. So we're not worried about it being racially driven if you're keeping these governmental entities together. But on the Latino side, we do need to find how we're going to work our way into those communities in terms of where the lines belong within them. I think is a question that comes up a lot is how many seats do we need to draw that are majority Latino, or as Dr. Hanley correctly put it, it's actually an opportunity to elect their preferred candidate seats. And I think I would be shocked and stunned if there was any reduction from where we are now. The question will be, as we're looking at these communities and these numbers, are we looking at more? Should there be another one that has the numbers to justify it? Or are we reaching a point where the community and that lives in those neighborhoods, that ultimately is the opinions we want to hear from, are not looking for that kind of concentration and looking more to be spread out? So both views are perfectly valid. The Voting Rights Act obviously weighs in strongly in terms of the draw the seats where you can, but they still need to be tied to community definitions other than just race. So we are looking for that. The key point I was trying to make there is the tribes are easy because they've clearly identified governmental areas, with some areas like Flagstaff that have significant Native American populations off of the reservations. Whereas in the Latino community, we're looking more for more of a blank slate to define those communities.
I think this may be a logical breaking point where I'm expecting maybe a deeper dive into some of these topic points, but let's take a quick 10-minute break, and we will reconvene. Thank you, everybody. Ask if everybody can please take your seats, and we'll get ready to reconvene. Okay, I think we're all ready, and I'm going to turn it right back over to Doug to continue the conversation on agenda item number 6, our draft map decision discussion. Take it away, Doug.
Thank you, Chair. I think we've had really good input. I know we all have lots of notes from the big picture 30 to 35,000 foot level that we've discussed so far. I can guarantee, given just the thoughts and requests that we've heard so far, you're going to see big changes to the grid map coming out of those for you to evaluate and see if you're happy with the resulting changes or not on a case-by-case basis. And one thing I do want to emphasize, I think the Commission's aware of this, but just for those that may be tuning in, especially for the first time as we get down to really nuts and bolts of drawing for the first time today, that everyone should remember no decision is final until the whole map is final. So a lot of these things will happen in every project like this we take on is someone says, can we do this in this district? We do it. It works pretty well looking in isolation in that one district. But then a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks down the line, some other big issue comes up. And the phrase you'll hear again and again is ripples. Every decision ripples into the surrounding districts. So a decision that, a request you make today that the mappers draw and present to you tomorrow and you like it, so we incorporate it, may very well get undone in 3 or 4 weeks because of another request, another community consideration, or another factor in the criteria that comes up that then ripples across and impacts that. So those putting in requests and ideas through the public comments should keep in mind that nothing is final until the whole map is final. So stay alert, stay paying attention, and if something does impact the change that one of them got made early on, they should weigh in yet again. Say, hey, this decision you just made undid what you did a month ago. Can you find a way to do both together? So this is going to be an iterative process of lots of changes, and the map seeing significant change from day to day as we go through this. Hopefully, as we get down closer and closer to the final map, the changes will get smaller and smaller as we're refining and fine-tuning more than swinging whole districts from different parts of the state. But for now, people should not be surprised if districts just pick up and move from one part of the state to another as we make different changes. So there were a couple of comments that have come up from the public that I wanted to bring up and see, not to look for any decisions from the commission at this point, but just to get the sense of the 5 of you if there are changes that you want to see or that you've thought about at this point. Obviously, there are lots of changes to be made, so if you haven't thought about it yet, perfectly fine. But if you do have guidance on these different issues, we'd certainly welcome that. One thing we heard about quite a bit was, and I think my impression was we heard very different opinions about this, is the kind of Cochise, Santa Cruz County. I think we heard a lot of fairly clear stuff about the Marana, Saddlebrook north side of Tucson, but very different opinions about the south side, Green Valley, south side of Tucson. And so to the degree that any of you have processed that input and have your own opinions and reactions to what the residents have said about does Cochise make more sense with Graham and Greenlee? Does it make more sense with Tucson? Does it make more sense bypassing Tucson and going through Santa Cruz to be with staying more rural? Any thoughts you have on that question would be one that we would appreciate if you have any direction on that front. And then I can kind of, there are really 3 that are top of mind in my mind at this point, although of course there are a lot more that have come up that you're welcome your direction on. One is that Cochise, Santa Cruz, south of Tucson area question. The other, 1 or 2 of you already commented on this, is the Verde Valley, Sedona question. Does that go more with Flagstaff? Does that go more with Prescott? Which makes more sense? And then The other one, I think, where I'm actually pleasantly surprised by how many comments we've gotten from the local residents on this, but the Yuma County question of is it a good division now? Does it make sense from a keeping communities of interest perspective? A couple of you commented on this already, but if others wanted to weigh in on that, that was the third kind of issue we've heard a lot about already that pops in my mind. I wanted to see if you have any direction or requests on. Again, nothing on this is binding. One thought to have in mind is that it is very common that there's both sides seem to have a good opinion on this that makes sense. How do we decide? And a lot of the times the way those decisions get made is what makes more sense for what works better for an entirely different part of the map. So if option A and option B are equal weights in your mind, if you don't have a strong opinion whether Verde Valley should be with Prescott or with Flagstaff, then we can see which way works out best for the other parts of the map and just see how that plays out and let the fates decide if you are up in the air. But to the degree that at this point you have any preliminary thoughts on any of those three issues, we'd welcome that.
Again, I just want to clarify, these are excellent points that we need to dive into, and I thank you for that introduction. Are we speaking from a 35,000-foot level, or are we also diving into a congressional versus a legislative conversation? Because these are specific areas, and it's a different conversation with both. And actually, I would even argue there's a philosophical question about keeping legislative districts with congressional districts, or are people better represented by having cross boundaries where they have options, even though it may not, it's legislative versus congressional. So can you clarify, are we having a broad conversation or a specific conversation?
Very good question. I actually think part of the reason these three issues stand out is they come into play in both maps. But to your point, the answer might be different in the two maps. I always remember one of the big debates that came up with Verde Valley wanting to be separate from Prescott was water issues, which were their specific differences were mainly settled at the state legislative level. So they preferred to be separate in congressional, but they found it very important. This is 20 years ago, so welcome differing opinions now. But 20 years ago, they very strongly wanted to be separate in the legislative map because that's where that policy debate happened, and they didn't want to be overwhelmed. They didn't want to be in a legislative district where the overwhelming majority of voters were for Prescott. They would then overweigh them. So I think these three issues come into play in both maps, but to your point, the answer may be different in the two maps.
Okay, so you'd like to elicit dialogue on those areas as it relates to both maps, it sounds like. And that's constructive. That's
Yes.
fine. Okay.
Can I just ask a question? Do we want to focus on those areas, or would we want to maybe, and this is just process, could we instead say, right now, let's focus on, we could still look at those areas, but let's focus on congressional, and then dive into that a little bit, even with those areas. And then we'll see how they blend when we get to legislative. From my own perspective, toggling back and forth could get a little confusing over what are we talking about now, which areas, because we have population differences that we're dealing with, and what we might be able to accomplish in a legislative area, we may not be able to do in a congressional because of the population. Just a question about process.
Certainly, I think we'd welcome whatever feedback you makes sense in whatever format you wish to give. Whatever's easiest for you.
I would support Commissioner Lerner's recommendation and suggest we jump to congressional and start having a dialogue.
I'm comfortable with that. I just want to make a larger point, and I think this is probably why Doug is speaking about this from this higher level. Everything that we do has broader implications and consequences. And so, as I was alluding to, representation on a congressional level also is relevant to whether or not people have representation on a legislative level. And this is, I mean, the process is complicated. We have to bifurcate it. I'm all for that. But let's not limit ourselves in the conversation and our understanding of the needs of representing these communities of interest, because they're wanting representation. And so let's just keep all of it in our minds, as hard as that is.
It makes sense if you want to start with Congressional.
Oh, Madam Chair, Vice Chair Watchman here.
Please.
And thank you, Doug, and I do support what Commissioner Lerner is suggesting. I'm still a little bit vague on the process, and we throw out these ideas with all the staff here. Are they going to generate some feedback for us today, or it seems like we could be headed down a piecemeal approach, and so, you know, we may have so many different variations and options that at the end of the day, you know, how do we get back to, you know, deciding on each suggestion? And so I guess I'm speaking more to a process, and, you know, do we, well, how do we document it, and how do we look at the results of our suggestions, and so that it's orderly, and that at the end of the day, again, we don't have, you know, too many options that we hard to digest and come back. So maybe we could talk a little bit more about kind of a more definitive process. Now I have my list, and I'm sure my colleagues has their list, and so, you know, do we dance around it, or we, you know, get cut to the chase and, you know, start looking at, maybe start with the congressional side and then to the legislative side, and see where we stand with each of our suggestions. I'm just trying to figure out what the process is so that we don't, at the end of the day, have too many options, and that we have other issues to try to get through those options. So, Madam Chair, maybe a discussion on a more definitive, non-piecemeal approach, because that's how I think we're heading in that direction.
Sure. Madam Chair, I would describe it at this point as we're still in kind of a brainstorming stage, without a doubt. I think 100% this process will get more and more structured and more defined as you get down the road, and specifically when we come back with these results. One of the challenges of being at the...
Oh, wait, hold on. You said get back with these results. So when will that happen? Is that going to happen in a matter of minutes, or do we have to give you an idea, and then it's going to take a day or two to get back with the results?
Doug,
So,
I can help you out.
yeah,
All
so I'm just trying to get an idea of, you know, if we throw something out, is it going to take a matter of minutes, or do we have to adjourn for a bit and come back, and how many suggestions can you take, and then we run the manipulation, and then it comes back, and then it's broadcast on the board, you know, kind of. So I'm looking at a process so that I have
Right,
better
so
understanding.
putting together the grid maps took, you know, a week and a half, 2 weeks to make, you know, one person, equal population balance. And within this time frame, our the mapping team being here, our purpose is to listen and, you know, take notes of what each of your views are. And then the intention is that we fully plan on having a late night tonight. We want to get through and document in an audit log what all of your key points are. And then we'll go through and start making versions of modifications to the grid map. We have 10, 15 points already about keeping tribal reservations together, communities of interest, looking at where growth is, where those economic drivers are. And I want to remind you, when I presented on the grid map back September 14th, I really wanted to be very clear that I did not look at any of those factors. I simply looked at county lines and population, and that is it. So, you know, what has been approved for the grid map, that clean slate, that's going to look wildly different. Taking all of these valid points into, you know, into what could be the draft map for Congressional District version 1, version 2, version 3. So our intent when we're going to continue to listen. I think, you know, Doug running the dialogue and you guys, you know, saying your points, we'll make notes of it. put those versions together tonight as a complete of a picture as we can, and then come back tomorrow, continue to listen, and then show off, what we've put together.
Yeah, I think we're on exactly the same page, which is one of the challenges of being at the big picture level is the big picture changes take a long time. Later on we're talking about, let's, move let's trade Ahwatukee for Tempe. That small change down the road will be quick, and we may even be able to do some of that live or during a little break. But at this point, yes, I don't anticipate even the requests you've made so far would all be drawn in for tomorrow. I can't imagine they would be. Where this could be useful, though, is to get as much of these pieces in so that, for example, as we put the legislative map up, the legislative grid map up. So, for example, what do I have in your mind that So you can see the yellow legislative district 7 running along the east side of the state. As we go to put the Navajo Nation together, if that makes sense best sense to put into district 7, well then 7 pulls up and Cochise is no longer in the district. So these pieces may fit in as we're doing other pieces. What do we do to then balance the map once we put the Navajo Nation and Hopi together in one seat? So those kinds of things will be useful guidance, but yeah, no, I would agree, Brian, that we won't be back to you in an hour, probably even tomorrow morning, with all of the options you've asked for so far.
I want to make an important point, though, and that doesn't preclude us as commissioners from having dialogue and debate about the difficult choices that we all know are facing us. That dialogue is constructive and necessary, and is not contingent upon our mapping team making these manipulations. And so I would challenge the 5 of us to take advantage of our time to philosophically embrace the challenge in front of us and debate and have conversation, even if we can't adjust each and every line as we're talking. It's still constructive.
To the degree, as I say, you can brainstorm. To the degree you have points and thoughts you want to throw out that have occurred to you, great. And to the degree you feel like you've gotten those out, and can release the mapping guys to go do their thing once you reach that point. But yeah, any thoughts you have are handy, because as we're making changes in one area, we'll run into decisions in others. So to the degree we have your kind of wish list. If anything were possible, what would you like to see in the map? That can be handy for us.
So would now be a good time to bifurcate discussing congressional versus legislative? It just seems that my peers are interested in having the separate conversations.
From my perspective, Madam Chair, it would be easier from a thought process to be able to at least start that way, and then we can move on from there. I mean, we do know, as you've said, we know there's going to be ramifications all the way down the line, but we can at least start thinking from, and I'm fine with either way, whether congressional or legislative. Maybe congressional just because they're larger areas. I don't know.
That makes sense. For us, we're, as Brian said, we're digesting and recording all these kind of wish list brainstorming ideas if everything would work out. So congressional start works for us.
Are there specific sources of information additionally from us that you'd like now as we dive into the congressional maps?
No, I think, like I said, no need to force anything. I'm looking for thoughts you've had as you've listened to the public so far. I threw out those 3 areas as areas that we did hear a lot of comments on, but there are others, of course. So thoughts that have occurred to you and kind of wish list items that are on your list, we'd love to hear. And if you covered them all this morning, that's great too. Or not this morning, earlier this afternoon. Lost track of time already.
I'll open, I'm thinking, I'm sorry, I was actually thinking about the past districts and the way in which we begin the dialogue from the grid maps versus the past districts. You know, translating where geographic areas to the grid maps from the previous congressional districts is hard. There's, you know, the mapping. And I don't want to reference the old districts, so that's why I'm struggling a little bit. Colleagues, can please, with congressional districts, what's on your mind with the boundaries, your priorities?
So I'll go ahead and just jump in and start and work our way down. I'll just do one thing. I'm just going to, I'm thinking I'm just going to make one suggestion. We've already talked about tribes being together, but I'm not necessarily in favor of this one large, that circle that you had. Doesn't necessarily do it for me. But it was an interesting one. I have been looking at all of those, and I appreciate the fact that people are coming up with very creative ideas. But I would say that we want to take the Navajo and the Hopi and then some of the groups over on the western side, the Havasupai, Kaibab Paiute, put them into, you know, and that's basically taking a lot of the north from basically from east to west across, where we were taking a number of those tribes. I keep forgetting to lean forward. It's possible potentially to go south too, down to San Carlos. That's something we can certainly be talking about, and White Mountain Apache, and then over to Yavapai Apache as well. I'm not sure how far we would take those, but at least across that top piece would be one suggestion that I would have to combine some of those tribes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I agree with Commissioner Lerner's comments about including the tribes. The next area, I guess, as I stated earlier, is just the Hispanic community that reside in the areas of Tucson and Phoenix and the Yuma area. You know, from the maps, obviously those are significant populations, and so congressionally, you know, how do we consider that? I think in the Phoenix area, you do have the minority congressional districts, and so not the reference that we have right now, but I think those are what we see right now could lend itself to what we could see with our new districts, and so recognizing the Hispanic and Latino voting pattern or population primarily in the Phoenix area, keeping that intact, I think would be something that I'd like to see. And moving to the Tucson area and Yuma, obviously keeping the Hispanic population intact. And then maybe getting back to the Native vote and the Native population. I know that you have Pasquayaki and Tohono west of Tucson, and then of course you got two tribes in the Yuma area, Cocopah and Kushan, and so perhaps those four tribes in a single area, you know, might be a good consideration. I think Tohono does rise up to the Gila Bend area, and they do have some pockets of tribal lands, I think in the Glendale area, but that's not contiguous, and so perhaps that's something maybe would be left out. But so in addition to the Native communities in the northern part, the four tribes in the south part of the state might be something to think about. The two tribes north of Yuma, actually is the Colorado River Indian tribe. That's along the Colorado River. Perhaps including that in the same area as the Yuma tribes might be something to think about. So I'll stop there, but those are the two focus areas that I think would be very beneficial for what I think is important for the state.
Commissioners Neal? York, please.
I think congressionally, there's a lot of commonality with what I've heard from my fellow commissioners. And I think if you look at the northern half of the state, you actually can combine those northern counties almost intact, all the way across east to west. And it is a large area, but at least it's all in the north and doesn't come all the way down to the south. And it would achieve keeping all the tribes together and having at least a somewhat more compact district for our biggest district. For the Hispanic and Indian community south of Tucson, I think keeping them together is critical to keep a community of interest together. But I think that to get the right population right now, and the current map, not grid map, but current existing map, that district goes all the way up into Maricopa, and I don't think that that's a great idea. I think it'd be better to have that not go to Maricopa. But in order to do that and achieve the population, they would have to take the central part of Tucson. And I think that actually creates a very cohesive district that would work quite well. So it would go all the way from Yuma to Santa Cruz. You have the whole southwestern part of Tucson and the whole main urban part of Tucson. And then for the remainder of Tucson, and today Tucson has 3 different congressional districts that come and cut into Tucson. And with the population changes, that isn't going to happen realistically. And so a second district that goes from Cochise County and then swings across that northern piece of Tucson, north of River Road, out to Oro Valley and Marana, and taking the south part of Pinal that's part of Marana and part of Oro Valley, really, Saddlebrook, and having that be a district, I think all sort of flows fairly well.
Commissioner York.
You asked about the Verde Valley, going to Flagstaff. We heard that people in Sedona shop at Flagstaff, but the people in my head, is from a congressional standpoint, I think Yavapai County needs to stay together with Cochise or. I like that northern idea that Commissioner Lerner had. The other thing is I think about, maybe it's not the congressional level, but there was a lot of comments about Tukey being included with Maricopa and the Kyrene School District. I'm not sure how that falls into the congressional somehow we have to divide up the East Valley and at least two seats. And Queen Creek is growing and somewhat rural in a growth area, kind of maybe like some of the cities in the West Valley of Maricopa. So I don't know. I don't know how you make that contiguous, but they're kind of like-minded issues there, Gila Bend, with the electrical cars and trucks. So, but then maybe then you're north of I-60 a little bit and west out to Santan, east out to Santan, and maybe Stapley Road or is a good dividing line for Valley Street.
Thank you. You know, the only thing I'd like to add that's on my mind is this conceptual challenge of the population being centered in Maricopa County, and do we have spokes in which we have rural areas tapping into population centers where it's more dense and balance that out, or to truly redistrict based on communities of interest in those more rural areas, which has that challenge of a very, very big geographic area. And how the citizens feel and how a representative would feel having to navigate that geographic area. Look, at the end of the day, we're not going to be able to avoid that. It's going to, by definition, there are going to be a couple of congressional districts that are just going to be very large. But I struggle a little bit with balancing those needs. And I wonder, are there enough communities at the outskirts of Maricopa County, communities of interest that align naturally with those more rural areas that make some of that partnerships a little more natural? So we don't have to have as much of the geographic expanse.
Madam Commissioner, Commissioner York, part of what I heard, I thought, on our tour was that the rural areas definitely wanted to stay together and were frustrated with the inclusiveness of the high population areas being tapped into their area and created as part of their district. So my consensus is we try to strive to create rural areas that are population heavy enough to keep them separate.
There's no doubt that the rural communities are a community of interest that have passionately shown up to express their concerns and their deep desires to protect their way of life. I have one concern that's kind of in the back of my mind about that population. It has to do with competitiveness, but it's much deeper than that. It has to do with communities of interest. And that is keeping our eyes on, are there communities of interest within that huge expanse that if we redistrict based on those rural areas, they will be disenfranchised and have no voice because it may end up being pretty distorted in a partisan perspective. And maybe those communities will be well served. I'd like to understand that. So that's something on my mind about how to balance representing, you know, there are competing communities of interest here that I think we have to keep on our mind.
Chair Newberg, I think it's something I've been really thinking about as well. We heard a lot about this idea of representation. We also heard a lot about competitiveness. And what we seem to know from what we're hearing is that those folks who don't feel represented want more competitiveness so they can have a voice. But it's how we get around to doing that, because it is a challenge, I think, for those when we look at some of these areas, and I've been looking at some of the draft maps and some other maps that I've been playing with, we do often have these imbalanced areas where people feel like they're not having some of that voice that you're speaking of. So I think we are going to be challenged with how we approach that to the best that we can.
And this is an area where we need public input because we're balancing competitive needs or different needs. And we need to know if you're in a minority and your larger interests are being well served because you're affiliating with other groups that you affiliate with, that's great. If it's not, help us understand what's not working That's just more specific data, and I think as we wrestle with these decisions, I think it would be helpful.
I think that was all very useful information on the congressional map. If there's anything else on that, or do you want to offer thoughts on the legislative?
Oh, I think we could probably do a lot more feedback on the congressional side.
I'll just add one more on the congressional right now because I figure I'll just do one at a time. But that is the Colorado River area. We know that's, while we want to do something, I think, to connect the tribes across the north, we also have groups along the Colorado that feel very connected to each other in terms of communities of interest with Mojave County and La Paz County. And so trying to pull that together. We already have that in the grid map. We might have to make some adjustments because of tribal locations, but some of the otherwise Mojave County and La Paz might be able to be connected.
So I will say with congressional maps, I do want to point out a pattern that I'm seeing, and it goes along with what some of the points you guys are talking about right now. So let me share my screen again. If you look at, I don't want to call out any specific plan, one over the other, but I am seeing a pattern in some of these early congressional district maps where like 4, CD5, CD6, you can see from north of Maricopa, it's all one district. So you're able to have that population balance meeting within that target deviation for population and still having all those northern communities, northern tribes, all still together on a congressional scale.
Can we dive into a little bit more of the congressional districts focused on Maricopa County? We haven't talked much about those unique groups. From my perspective, there are different pockets. There's, PV, Scottsdale, possibly even, extending into Fountain Hills. There's the Southeast Valley, Chandler, Mesa, Gilbert. Where those boundaries are, there's competing interests. I mean, Tempe, West Mesa versus maybe Eastern Mesa, Gilbert, then going south into Santan, Queen Creek. I think we need to pay attention to that district. And the West Valley again. I mean, Maricopa County is going to require some attention. I know we're focusing maybe on the simpler outer skirts, but that is where the bulk of our population is, and it's going to be shifted. I see, yeah, I'm going to end it there and open it up to other conversation.
Madam Chair and Commissioners, I guess if you have, I think you raise very good questions that you're likely to spend hours and hours on over the next couple of months. And I think if you have specific things you want to see in the maps, Commissioner Meal was referring to freeways and things that might make good dividers in there. This is a good time to share it. If you don't have specifics at this point, you'll have many weeks to come up with specific revisions and changes you want to see in this
We have many weeks, however, I'd like to say that it is our goal, if the schedule holds true, to have draft maps that may be voted on as early as October 21st, I believe, or maybe 22nd. But so we have weeks, but I'd like to capitalize on the days and weeks that are ahead of us, because if the better our draft maps are, I think the more rewarding and informative that last 30-day process is, and the public feedback we get, and the more we can fine-tune and provide the best maps possible. So I appreciate that we have time, but actually, let's enter the debate and dialogue now.
Madam Chair, if I could get back to, you mentioned the metropolitan area of Phoenix relative to the tribes. I know that there's 4 in the area, maybe 5. You got Salt River and Fort McDowell. I believe the Salt River comment was they'd like to be, or the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community would like to be included in the districts of their neighboring towns, Scottsdale and maybe Tempe. I'm not sure if we heard from the Fort McDowell tribe, but they're close in proximity. And then when I look at the grid map, it looks like Gila River Indian community is split. And so then just south of there is the Maricopa or Auction Indian community. And so I guess the point is we need to pay attention to the Gila River Indian community so that it's not split. I think it's split here in 2, if you look at the Congressional grid map. And so, and one thought obviously was, at least in my mind, is those 4 Phoenix area communities to be in one district might be something to look at from a configuration standpoint. I'm not sure if it's possible given the population, but keeping that in mind, I think is something that we need to think about. But first and foremost is not splitting the Gila River Indian community. It is rather large, a large land base south of Chandler and Gilbert.
Commissioner Washington, just your point you raised there at the end, that is something that has come up in each redistricting round.
Yeah.
Should we try to put all 4 urban tribes in one district? It raises a good question, because if that's done, it really has to be through the East Valley district, so that you really can't be with Scottsdale. So that's the choice that has to be made there one way or the other. So whether Fort McDowell would rather be an East Valley seat with all the links, all 4 tribes, or with Scottsdale.
Yeah.
Again,
Well, I don't know if we've heard from them. I know we did hear comment from the Salt River Indian community, but I don't believe the other 3 tribes. I think they may be submitting something at some point, but I'm not sure that that's going to happen. But we did hear from the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community that they have great ties, and they believe they're a part of the Scottsdale and Tempe community of interest. And so, putting that aside, I think it looks to me like Gila River and the Auction community have more, rural elements, if you will, notwithstanding them actually bordering Chandler and Ahwatukee. And so I guess hopefully we'll get some more comment from them to better understand their desires and the direction that they like to see on a congressional basis.
Commissioner York, one of the Maricopa districts I was thinking about that made sense to me was incorporating South Mountain, the airport, and Maryville, Alhambra, and portions of southern Glendale into sort of a minority-majority area.
I know this may be a little late in the process. I want to remind everybody, we do have interpreters if anybody needs a Spanish interpreter or is having any language problems. So just a reminder, and I apologize, we did not make that explicit earlier.
On another note, with the Maricopa County area, just as a note, since I think Commissioner York mentioned population growth in the Southeast Valley, so I think we're going to need to take a close look at the Southeast Valley on how how it's grown and the anticipation of growth that's there. In some of these cases, we're going to I think we can't avoid splitting some communities. City of Mesa, which is rapidly becoming one of the largest cities in our state, for example, could easily be split. And it's not uniform, even though it's all Mesa. There are different perspectives between West Mesa and East Mesa in terms of communities of interest and their connections to their surrounding communities. So some of East Mesa, for example, might feel more aligned with some parts of Gilbert or Queen Creek areas in terms of a community of interest perspective. So while it's great if we can keep a lot of these cities and towns together, in some cases in Maricopa County, because of the size of them, we may need to divide. Just as a follow-up on that, since it got quiet. As an example, I would say West Mesa and Tempe are probably more aligned than East Mesa, and then East Mesa, like I mentioned, in maybe Gilbert, Queen Creek, or some of those areas. So West Mesa, Tempe, maybe South Scottsdale are probably similar communities of interest in that sense. And then we could take a look at other parts of Mesa and how it might be aligned with Queen Creek, Chandler, Gilbert, parts of it.
And I want to make clear, Commissioner Lerner, you're speaking about congressional districts, because a lot of that same exact language could be highly relevant to legislative districts.
Absolutely. No, this is all congressional.
Doug, is there additional, contextual feedback that would be helpful from us about how we're further thinking about congressional districts? Or is this sufficient information to come back with? I mean, I know you said maybe not tomorrow, but if possible, tomorrow with an adjusted congressional map? Like, what additional types of information would be helpful for you to hear?
I think what you'll see tomorrow morning is an in-progress map, drawing in whatever we've been able to get done at that point. Yeah. So I think we've got plenty of input to run with that. We welcome additional input as this moves ahead. But if you want to go to legislative map, we certainly have plenty to do on the congressional map.
Any other thoughts from my colleagues on the congressional map? Okay, if not, let's turn over to the legislative side.
I could start. And again, speaking to the reservations, clearly, I think we heard from Navajo Nation when they're up there that the legislative proposed district, or the grid, does split up Navajo into 3 different segments. So keeping that intact is probably the direction that the Navajo Nation has presented to us as a commission. That's probably the first thing that I see out there. I'll stop there. I'll look at my notes and my map here again.
I'd like to make an observation about the legislative districts as we begin the conversation. You know, as I was studying all of them, I noted that the legislative districts seem to be much more extreme than the congressional districts. You know, I'm presuming that that was a result of honoring communities of interest and keeping people intact. With that, it may be possible that certain communities of interest are being disenfranchised. And so as we look at the legislative districts, I'd like to understand that, where the communities are and where certain communities may have been disenfranchised. There are 30 districts, it's more complicated. I want to make sure that we reserve sufficient time to dive deep into them. The balancing of, you know, that level of community of interest with all the 6 constitutional criteria, you know, keeping compact, contiguous districts, and in addition to that, trying to balance for competitiveness. I just want to say that that's something that's very much on my mind. And again, not from the perspective of competitiveness in and of itself. I'm focused on, are there communities of interest that are not being represented because they're being drowned out?
Chairwoman, I know we've heard a lot of, we've heard a number of folks talk about that, but can you give a specific example of one of the ones that we've heard that talks about them where they're feeling that their voices are not heard? Maybe it would help as a specific example. And I know it just would be one of many.
You know what, Commissioner Lerner, I'm thinking through all the public feedback, and I'm having a hard time identifying one, and to be honest, I'm reluctant to even identify one, because I think it might be unfair. I think it's more of a broader question and lens through which we need to think about this. You know, that when people are asking us for competitive districts, I guess what I'm getting at is, let's just understand the district in a deeper way to understand who's being represented and who's not. Because at the end of the day, this process is about maximizing empowerment and representation from as many Americans as we can. And so, I'm sorry. I would like to, I guess I could draw the example again from a rural community that may not be competitive, where the minority may be okay if their larger economic interests are being met and they identify as rural, and you know, their needs are being met. That's very different than a minority community that has nobody to go to and feels that they have fundamental needs that nobody's hearing. And so they're just different conversations.
Thank you. Actually, that clarifies.
Commissioner Lerner, I'll add an anecdote from one of our public hearings, because we had people that stood up, and there was 2 adjoining districts, and people from Party A were referring to the one district as very competitive and the other district as very not competitive. And people from Party B were saying the same thing, but in flip. And it was, if your party was losing in that district, it wasn't competitive. And if your party was winning, it was competitive. So we have to filter some of the comments that we're getting. and we have to do the best job we can to draw the best maps we can. But some of these things that we're hearing, you have to also have a little bit of humor with and realize, because I was looking at the data, and those two districts were almost identically the same spreads in the last few elections from one party to the other. So however competitive or not competitive they were about identical. But in people's perceptions, that's how they were perceived.
Good point, thanks.
Legislative district, Doug, don't we have 8 minority, majority districts already established?
Generally speaking, yes, a couple of them have dropped below mathematical majority over the course of the decade. So, but yes, we have 7 that are 44% Latino by citizen voting age or higher, plus the 1 Native American majority seat.
So to me, that would be a starting point for legislative.
Yes, I would never say never, but I would be stunned if we went below that.
Right.
And related to that, Doug, just as communities of interest, we would love to see that map. We would love to see where those demographic groups are, where they are geographically compact. I think that would help us with the legislative maps.
You can see all that on the socioeconomic report. They're all in there.
And if we want to jump into some more detail, I'll start by supporting Vice Chair Watchman's desire on the Navajo Nation. And there is a chance to create a legislative district that would include the whole Hualapai, the Havasupai, the Navajo, and the Apache. And it would be the strangest district we would draw. And you would need a connection down the east side of the state in order to make that happen. But you would end up with about, and it would need to have either Flagstaff or the White Mountains to get the right population. And I think Vice Chair Watchman mentioned that there's more of a connection with Flagstaff, and that's what I think we heard from many of the people testifying. So I would suggest Flagstaff be a part of that same legislative district. And if you start with that, it really helps set up the rest of the map. So I think it's a good place to take a look at. And then that would leave the White Mountains and the Copper Corridor combined, which we heard a lot of positive testimony about. And then you drop down into southern Arizona. And if you start with the Southwest and keep Yuma split in a similar fashion, which again, we heard a lot of testimony about, then you sort of work your way into Tucson. And some of the Tucson current districts are not, on the south side, are probably fairly similar to where we might want to be looking again this time. But we heard a lot of testimony again on the foothills, trying to get it into a legislative district with Marana Oro Valley, where they've been really split and people not happy that they've been split. So Marana Oro Valley and the foothills into a district which would probably need a little bit of the east side, the Houghton Corridor, in order to get to the population. And that need leaves some very solid districts in the central part of Tucson, part of which would, at least one of which, or two of which, would be minority majority districts, and the other just sort of in between all of that.
There are strong communities of interest in the Northwest that would very much like to stay together, like Havasu City, Seligman, Kingman. I think they work well together.
Chair, are you referring to within Mojave County, or are you thinking of?
Correct, Mojave County.
Okay, you're not adding things in. Okay.
In the same way that Commissioner Meal commented about, how some of these northern Tucson areas want to be connected, I think we also heard that from Maricopa County. Some of the northern parts of Maricopa County, we heard this with Carefree, Cave Creek, and Anthem. They were saying they were more connected to Maricopa County than to Yavapai, where they were currently. And they would like to be placed in a Maricopa County district versus a Yavapai County, because they felt that they had better connections, more community of interest connections for those. Taking some of those northern reaches together. I know it doesn't reach the population yet, but we're working on it.
Right, I know, and that was where my mind was going again, back to that spoke idea. Do they have to tap into the Maricopa County population in order to reach the threshold? But I think in an ideal world, if they, that would be a good bifurcation. To not have to go up north into the rural, keep them with Maricopa County.
On that topic, I think some of the commenters, when they were talking about North Maricopa County, raised a good point, which is we often default to freeways being borders, because they are very disruptive impacts. But up there, we had a number of people talk about they attend schools across the freeway, and maybe I-17 in the north part of the county isn't a good border. If the commissioners took that to heart and agreed with that, or that's where I'm at.
Yeah, I think we heard that in particular from Anthem, saying that we're going back and forth with schools, with shopping, with everything all the time. And I think we heard that in Central Phoenix in some areas. Some folks were saying that they felt that the freeways were a boundary. Others were saying it was not. So I think we'd have to look carefully at that, whether it's not consistent on, and it also depends on, again, what that community's interests are. We know that in some cases, like in the downtown Phoenix area, when the I-10 was extended there, it actually split up historic neighborhoods that had previously been one unit, with that community. And now they are split, but on the other hand, they still do a lot together. There's still a lot of connection. So freeways is something we probably do need to look at.
From my perspective, freeways are somewhat arbitrary. I understand that growth happens around them, but they do not necessarily in and of themselves define communities of interest. And in terms of geographic compactness, again, the highways are arbitrary. It's not like it's a mountain or a river or something that's, impenetrable. So I'm quite flexible as it relates to those boundaries, provided that the goal is to be uniting communities of interest that may transcend that arbitrary boundary.
And your comment reminded me, when you said mountains, we heard a lot about Mingus Mountain as well. And so that's one that was, the communities there were seeing that as a boundary. So I don't know how or where do that, but I know we heard a lot of folks talk about the fact that Mingus Mountain was a natural boundary between some of the communities in that area.
I'm fascinated with this emerging relationship between Tempe and Mesa. Mesa, and as it moves east into Gilbert, it used to be just a different character, but more and more there seems to be a little bit more of an urban feel in Tempe and West Mesa, and a little bit more collaboration as it relates to public transportation. I'm not quite sure if it's the leaders that are working so well or the population, but there's something going on in that area that I think warrants looking into maybe keeping together.
Talking along 60. 101.
I'm also going to guess in the Goodyear area, out in the West Valley, that growth, I think there's going to be change there. And I'm curious. I'd like to explore that area a little bit more. I think those boundaries are going to change, obviously.
Legislatively, for the very southeast part of the state, you have all the aerospace industry and some mining. And I think if you combine Cochise and Greenlee counties, the south half of Graham County, and then come into Pima County and pick up the Davis-Monthan Air Base and Sahuarita, where they have that's really the defense corridor, and all the way into Green Valley. And I think that ends up being a real cohesive district that we heard, again, a lot of people testify that would be favorable to that.
So, and I think you raise a good point, and maybe it's something for us to talk about at some point, is the whole idea of the border. Because we certainly know, with what you're saying with Cochise being with Graham and Greenlee, that question of being heard, and I'm just asking the question, I guess, and Commissioner Meal, since you live in that neighborhood, you might be able to address some of it, but it's that how to address some of these things, because Cochise County obviously has a lot of border issues as well. So I guess I'm just asking maybe for your thoughts on that.
I think with the district I described, it takes a good chunk of the border, and you're probably going to end up with most likely 3 legislative districts on the border, which I think is pretty similar to today. And I'd be surprised if that really changes. The configurations are going to change, and then there's 2 congressional districts that would have part of the border. And again, I suspect that will be similar. And I know all those communities have been very engaged on the border issues, and I would fully expect that to continue.
And if I remember correctly, in terms of our public tours, I think that in the south of the state, not counting Tucson, there's reasonable agreement. I mean, there's a lot of cooperation.
Madam Chair, it would be good to, as the discussion kind of slows down, it would be good to let the mapping team map. So if you have, obviously there will be lots more thoughts, but if you are getting kind of to the end of your list, releases.
So are we talking about discharging them for the rest of the day, as in mapping for tomorrow morning? Is that what you're alluding to?
Yes.
Okay. Can I just see if there's any other comments from my colleagues about legislative districts in Maricopa County? And it may be that conceptually it's a little easier to be focusing on the perimeters and then going in. I'm not sure we've given as much feedback, and that's an empirical question to the mapping team, about the inside of Maricopa County. But if you all feel that there's substantive information that will keep you busy to bring something to us tomorrow morning, we're thrilled with that.
Oh, yeah.
Is there, from my colleagues, anything else that you feel rises to the level of first day instructions to the mapping team, congressionally, legislatively, that would help them with the big picture? Okay, that was a great start. I'm glad it was helpful to you. I'm not sure it was helpful to us. I mean, in terms of just, throwing all these ideas out there, but we have a lot to talk about, and it's exciting. We're looking forward to getting, into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, I do want to say, just put it out there for both for the commissioners as you're thinking about it and for the residents as they're watching this. There's always this concern around this issue of if I'm not in the first map, well, then it's too late. Or is it better to come in at the end? And there really isn't a which is better than the other. So folks that haven't shared their thoughts yet, we definitely want them to share their thoughts. If they didn't hear their thoughts, if they've raised their thoughts and they didn't hear them mentioned today, that doesn't mean they're off the table. People should continue to weigh in. And yes, it is nice to see your ideas wrapped into the first or second version of revisions to the grid, but the final map is the only one that counts in the end. So getting your changes in at the end is perhaps even better. So I do want to kind of put to rest any concerns that may be out there about it's too late to share your thoughts. It's never too late until the map is final.
And Doug, do you think we gave you enough information to really have a productive evening and get things going?
Oh, yes. We will not come close to getting all these changes incorporated into maps for tomorrow. That's for sure. We'll do what we can and where to go from tomorrow.
And you know what? We presume that nothing will be completely linear, that we're going to have a lot of debate and dialogue, look at maps, make, continual adjustments. And to be honest, it's an organic process with the five of us as well, because we are continuously digesting public comment and learning. And so, again, it relates to what we said earlier to the public. It's a fluid process, and nobody should jump to any kind of conclusions too early about any, early maps or anything. So with this, yes, please, thank you, mapping team. We appreciate you, the late hours that it sounds like you're going to be doing tonight, whatever you can provide with us with a new map tomorrow as a new starting point would be amazing. And that does not preclude the commissioners from having additional conversation or just debate, dialogue about some of the philosophical aspects of what we're facing. And if there aren't any other, decisions, we don't have to do it. But I don't want to close the conversation just because we don't have physical mapping. So much of what we're doing is conceptual anyway. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, are we also going to look at comments? I think we had talked about that.
Yes, so in terms of the rest of the meeting, we will have the opportunity to look at public comments. We will not be able to take action on the public comments. We will be able to digest them and understand them. And but to be honest, that's not going to slow the process down. Our mapping team has enough to work with. But for the sake of our collective education, we can absolutely take a look at public comments. If that's something that the commission would like to do right now, we could certainly take a break and then come back before we close the meeting. But before we even go there, is there any other commentary or dialogue from my colleagues about mapping between today and tomorrow morning with our next meeting? Is there anything else conceptually absent of our mapping team that anybody would like to bring to the table for us to conceptually discuss? And if not, okay. So what time? So we're at almost about 3:30. We're about to close the meeting. Maybe I'll suggest a 10-minute break. We can pull up our public comments, begin to review them, and then we can reconvene and discuss whether or not there's any public comments we want to bring forth, and if not, we'll close the meeting. And so with, if there's, Commissioner Meal, please.
Would it make sense for us to officially dismiss the mapping team? Because we won't need them for this and they can go and start working.
Absolutely. Mapping team, you're dismissed. We appreciate your participation. We appreciate your very hard work about to come up. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning. With that, why don't we take a 10-minute break and we'll reconvene and finish up with public comments and the closing of our meeting. Thank you. I want to apologize. I think the break was maybe not quite efficient. As we went into the break, I was expecting that we might take the time to review public comments at this time. But in retrospect, given that our mapping team has more than enough information to keep them busy for the next, 15 hours, I think it might be more effective if the commissioners go home and review independently the thoughts, the feedback that's coming back from the public. And as a reminder, as we start our meetings, our review of public comments comes at the very beginning of our agenda. So that may be a more effective, efficient time to dive into that. And so with that, if there is no further discussion or, dissension on that topic, I'm going to suggest, and again, Doug, if there's nothing else that you would like to add on agenda item number 6 regarding the draft map decisions.
Oh, I think we're good for day one.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, I apologize for the inefficiencies, but this has been a remarkably constructive, positive first meeting. And we'll move to agenda item number 7. The next meeting date is tomorrow morning, October 5th at 8 a.m. Here again. And with that, agenda item number 8, closing of public comments. We'll now close public comments. Please note, members of the commission may not discuss items that are not specifically identified on the agenda. Therefore, pursuant to ARS 38-431.01H, action taken as a result of public comment will be limited to directing staff to study the matter, responding to any criticism, or scheduling the matter for further consideration and decision at a later date. With that, we'll move to agenda item number 9, adjournment. I will take a vote to adjourn. Vice Chair Watchman.
Aye.
Commissioner Meal.
Aye.
Commissioner Lerner. Aye. Commissioner York. Commissioner Newberg is an aye. With that, we will adjourn, and I look forward to seeing our staff, consultants, public, and colleagues tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Thank you, everybody, for your participation.